My name is Professor Gish. I'm the director of Phonesis. I teach in the Honors College. Most of you know me. I'm here to introduce our speaker today. It's Dr. Diana Shaub. She's Professor Emerita at Loyola University, Maryland, where she taught in the Political Science Department for almost 3 decades. Dr. Shaub has a PhD and MA in Political Science from the University of Chicago, and her BA is in Political Science from Kenyon College. Currently, she's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where her work is focused on American political thought and history, particularly Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, African-American political thought, Montesquieu, and the relevance of core American ideals to contemporary challenges and debates. Dr. Shaub's academic work is in political philosophy and American political thought, and she's one of the nation's finest scholars of the speeches and thought of Lincoln. She lectures across the country and has participated in scores of conferences and published many articles and book chapters on Lincoln, as well as Shakespeare, liberal education, women, and religion. She's the author of 4 books: What So Proudly We Hail, The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song, which was co-edited with Amy and Leon Cass; Erotic Liberalism, Women and Revolution in Montesquieu's Persian Letters; a monograph from the American Enterprise Institute that is titled Emancipating the Mind, Lincoln, the Founders and Scientific Progress; and recently this work, which is His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation. Yesterday she taught Professor Homework's class on Frederick Douglass's oration delivered at the unveiling of the Monument of the Freedmen in memory of Abraham Lincoln. Tonight she's going to be talking about Lincoln's second inaugural, the rhetoric of reconciliation, but today she's talking about Lincoln's Lyceum address, Democratic Theory for Citizens. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shaub.
Thank you. My subject this afternoon is a very early speech by a very young Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln belonged to the first generation of Americans who came of age after the passing of the founding generation. And Lincoln's speech centered on the ability of his generation to preserve that legacy. The speech was delivered in 1838. This was a time already of great national conflict that would, within a quarter century, eventuate in civil war. Lincoln, at the time of the speech, is only 28 years old. Not all that older than many of you. But he was already in his second term in the Illinois House of Representatives. He was a young Whig politician. He was an up-and-comer. And he had been invited to deliver a lecture at the Springfield Young Men's Lyceum. Lyceum was a kind of continuing adult education movement, and small towns all across the land had one of these lyceums. So the theme that he chose was the perpetuation of our political institutions. Now, in the speech, Lincoln presents a very frightening sketch of democratic dysfunction. He traces the rise in incivility and discord, tipping over into political violence. And he shows how the growing lawlessness, and worse, the toleration of lawlessness, eroded the people's trust in government. He looks into the future and he predicts that this disgust with an ineffectual government will actually provide an opening for demagogic populists across the political spectrum. Individuals of unbounded ambition would seize upon the disaffection of the citizens to undermine the constitutional order. So from very small beginnings in disrespect for the law, the entire experiment in self-government might be overturned. So Lincoln has described the disease, and he then prescribes the cure: fidelity to the Constitution and law. Democratic citizenship, according to Lincoln, does not permit disobedience of any kind. Even unjust laws must be religiously obeyed until they are repealed or reformed through constitutional channels, which include not only election, but the broad avenues of persuasion, all of those First Amendment rights of speech, press, peaceable assembly, and petition. Now, that's a cure that's very easy to state, right? Everybody ought to follow the Constitution and laws, but not so easy to instantiate. And the course of antebellum events shows that Lincoln's speech did not bring his generation to worship at the altar of law-abidingness. It is a kind of remarkable fact about all of these speeches of Lincoln's. They're all great speeches. We still study them. In their day, they were all failures in bringing about what he hoped to bring about. This speech didn't prevent the Civil War. The first inaugural didn't prevent the Civil War, so on. All right, so why should that matter to us if they didn't work then? Well, if we listen more attentively, perhaps we can do better. With its warning against politically dangerous passions, the Lyceum address, I think, is timeless, and it speaks to our divided polity as much as to Lincoln's own. Now, the basic lines of the argument in the speech are clear. I mean, I just sketched it in 2 paragraphs. But the details of the speech are complex in their layering, and I think they are challenging to many of our contemporary prejudices. Now, we're not going to have time to delve into every aspect of this speech, but what I want to do is select a few passages to examine more closely. So let's start with the title. Title is always a good place to start. The perpetuation of our political institutions. So perpetuation is not just Lincoln's subject, but it is his aim. And as an aim, it might be thought to have a conservative character. In other words, the task of Lincoln's post-founding generation, at least as presented early on in the speech, is limited. It seems to be the modest task of keeping intact and passing along to the next generation our grand and lucky inheritance as Americans. Yet, at the same time, perpetuation breathes hope for the future. Right? What does it mean to perpetuate? To perpetuate is to cause to endure permanently, indefinitely. And in the very last line of the speech, Lincoln compares our political institutions, which he desires to perpetuate, he compares those institutions to what he calls the only greater institution, by which he means the church. And the church is so rock solid in its foundations that, quote, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That is the last line of the speech. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The Bible verse that Lincoln is quoting from here is Matthew 16:18, and it is the verse in which Jesus founds the church on the disciple Peter's faith in the revealed Messiah. So what's Lincoln doing? What's he saying here? Why does he draw this comparison between politics and religion, between church and state? I think the question that he wants his audience to ask is, could a political founding rival the founding of Christianity? In other words, is there a form of government that is proof against death, such that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it? Now, Lincoln does say, as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. So this question of whether free government can endure and what is required to make it endure preoccupied Lincoln from the start of his career. In other words, already when he's 28 years old, he's raising this question. Are there threats to free government that will basically cause us to commit suicide? So if the beginning is half of the whole, Lincoln's beginning to this speech promises much. In surveying the situation, he informs Americans of 1838 that they are the legal inheritors of 2 fundamental blessings, basically the land and liberty. Now, Lincoln foresees no difficulty in passing along this goodly land, unprofaned, he says, by the foot of an invader. And I think he's actually still right about this, right? There are 2 days that live in infamy, December 7, 1941, and September 11, 2001. Right? Those are the 2 days in which there is an invader. I leave out 1812. People sometimes point out, you left out 1812, but those were just our old, the old mother country, the Brits, even though they did burn the White House, burn the Capitol. basically, we don't have much to fear from foreign invaders, is Lincoln's point. But serving as the caretaker of the political edifice is trickier, because the initial threat to that political edifice of liberty comes from an unavoidable source, time itself. Lincoln says it is our task to transmit the political edifice undecayed by the lapse of time and untorn by usurpation. In other words, time all by itself is a threat, and an insidious threat. As time elapses, we lapse. Those of us who are getting older know that happens to the physical body, right? As time elapses, we lapse. But the same thing is true of the political body as is true of the individual body. Almost imperceptibly, institutional decay and corruption set in. Now, the second threat, usurpation, right? That sounds violent, but it's worth noting that the literal meaning of usurpation is to take possession of by use. In other words, new practices, new usages can distort or overtake the original modes, the constitutional modes. An example might be the recent expansion of presidential power, right? Through the use of executive orders to do things that constitutionally should be done only by the legislative branch. And remember, this has been going on for many administrations now by both Democratic and Republican presidents. The use of executive orders to do things that legislatures ought to be doing. So that's maybe an instance of a kind of usurpation, and we've gotten used to it because it was used and nobody objected, and then it's used again, and then it's used further. So both of these dangers, right? There's a kind of chronic one of time, and maybe a more acute one of usurpation. Both of those dangers arise from within. In other words, they are forms of suicide. They bring about the self-destruction of self-government. So Lincoln has now described this double threat, time and usurpation. And he then turns to the evidence that he sees around him of system-wide breakdown in the 1830s. And he focuses on mob action, right? This growing lawlessness. And he focuses on two particular instances of mob action. He calls them the most dangerous in example and revolting to humanity. And he describes what happened in Mississippi. There was a mob in Mississippi that first targeted gamblers, hanged gamblers, then proceeded to lynch black men, and then white men, supposed to be leagued with the black men, and finally, random visitors from other states. And he develops a very lurid simile. He says, quote, "Dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest." Any of you know the Billie Holiday song, Strange Fruit? Similar description. The bodies of dead men hanging like Spanish moss on the trees. He then moves on to a second horror-striking scene, which just happens to be from another slave state, Missouri. Once again, Lincoln does all he can to shock his audience into sympathy with the victim. He says, quote, "A mulatto man by the name of McIntosh was seized in the street, dragged to the suburbs of the city, chained to a tree, and actually burned to death. And all within a single hour from the time he'd been a free man, attending to his own business, at peace with the world." Now, at this point, Lincoln interjects a question, and it is a question that he attributes to his audience. But you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? This is a favorite rhetorical technique of Lincoln's. Through his placement of questions, he's creating a kind of dialogic engagement with his audience. And sometimes, as here, he will put the words directly into the mouth of an objector or a naysayer, somebody who quarrels with him. Right? And this allows him to set forth kind of the likely grounds of resistance to the argument that he's making, and then for him to be able to respond to those quarrels. Other times he will pose the question himself. Then he's usually doing it as a way to kind of advance the argument or sort of signal a new phase in the argument. Now, before this present question, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? There were 5 previous questions, and after this question, there will be 7 more to follow. But this is unique in the questions that he puts because it is the only one of the 13 questions that he ascribes to you, his listeners. But you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? Now, why does Lincoln anticipate pushback from his audience at this point? I mean, I just read these stories out to you. What was your reaction? The 2 stories. Horrific, right? You were shocked and horrified, and we are today properly horrified at the nation's history of lynching. But Lincoln was addressing an audience that might have felt some sympathy with the lynch mob, or at least sympathy with the motives of the lynch mob, even if not with their extreme actions. Now, what were those motives? Now, before we jump to, say, racism, we need to look more closely at the actual incidents. And remember also that during these decades, from 1830 until the Civil War, the majority of extrajudicial hangings were of whites. That's not true after the Civil War. But before the Civil War, most of the extrajudicial lynchings are of whites. But Lincoln's examples are not of, horse thieves, cattle rustlers, out in the Wild West, who fell afoul of frontier justice and got lynched. In the Mississippi case, the initial target was riverboat gamblers. Now, gambling had been recently legalized in the state of Mississippi. But guess what? Lots of citizens, and maybe actually the most virtuous citizens, the most upstanding citizens, were morally opposed to gambling. I'm morally opposed to gambling. I can't stand that gambling is legal. Okay? So these upstanding citizens were angry at the perceived injustice of the gamblers, as well as the perceived injustice of the law that was now allowing gambling. Anger is a very potent sign of a thirst for justice. It's a thirst that is powerful enough to send human beings outside the law, especially when the law is slow or unreliable or simply wrong. Now, it's important to remember that during this same time period, public opinion was greatly aroused, not only against gamblers, but against a new type of abolitionist, the messianic abolitionists, those who wanted to bring about an immediate end to slavery. And they were very intemperate in their speech, and they were themselves very intolerant of political compromise. William Lloyd Garrison, who is the kind of leader of this new brand of abolitionism, his newspaper, The Liberator, had been founded in 1831, and then in 1833, Garrison established the American Anti-Slavery Society. And the American Anti-Slavery Society called for an immediate end to slavery, and it did so by calling for the annulment of the U.S. Constitution. So Garrison argued that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery compact. It was a pact with the devil, and that there was no hope for the nation in living under this tainted document, this impossibly compromised document. So a Garrisonian would refuse to cast a vote under the existing Constitution, even if that one vote would be the one that overturned slavery. It was the 50% plus one vote that would lead to an end to slavery, but it would be illegitimate to cast such a vote because the vote itself would have been cast under a corrupt system. So their view was, we refuse to touch the devil, even to kill him. Okay? So there's a tremendous emphasis on the purity of the individual conscience among the Garrisonians. Now, the gamblers, like the gamblers, radical abolitionists were engaged in a legal activity, but a very unpopular one. And this furor against the abolitionists, this anti-abolitionist anger, extended well beyond the slave states. It wasn't only slaveholders who objected to the Garrisonian abolitionists. This was a very strong feeling in the North, and especially in a state like Illinois, which was a free state, but had the most anti-black laws on the books of any of the states. Okay, so the Illinoisans were not too happy about this new brand of abolitionism. Now, in selecting the examples of mob rule that he does, Lincoln quite deliberately avoids the incident that was uppermost in the minds of his Illinois audience. And that incident was the murder of the abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy. In 1837, Lovejoy started an anti-slavery newspaper in Illinois, Alton, Illinois. He did so immediately after having been driven out of St. Louis. He tried to first publish an anti-slavery newspaper in a slave state in Missouri. Town just across the border, Mississippi River. You've got St. Louis on one side, Alton, Illinois on the other side. So he's been driven out of Missouri. He comes to Illinois, starts his paper. The Illinoisans don't like it any better than the Missourians did. And they threw his printing press into the river, and in the melee that broke out, Lovejoy himself was shot and killed. So Lincoln's speech comes just a few weeks after this incident. But Lincoln doesn't make any reference to it. Why not? Well, I think he is avoiding what we may call triggering his audience. But his purpose is not to cater to their sensitivities, but rather by temporarily avoiding any mention of that specific incident, to induce them to lift their sights to the larger matters that are at stake. And in fact, to try to loosen the hold of their partisan passions so that they can reason together, right? In other words, if he says the name Lovejoy on this occasion, half of them will be pro-Lovejoy and half of them will be anti-Lovejoy. And then they will get nowhere. Just like if I were to mention the name Trump, right? Some portion of you would be pro-Trump and some portion of you would be anti-Trump. And we would just go at it like this. Okay? So Lincoln makes no reference to this incident that has just happened and that is on the top of everyone's mind. Lincoln knows how difficult it is to challenge popular passion directly. Those who are in the grip of anger, and even worse, anger that is compounded by fear, they are disinclined to feel sympathy for others. They want sympathy for themselves. And aware of that resistance, I think what Lincoln is doing is he's sort of giving it a voice. He is in a way modeling what a more civil form of discourse would look like. And so the you of his audience does not come right out and say, well, what's the big deal? Those gambling thugs, they got what they deserved. Right? That's how they really feel. So they don't say that, at least not when Lincoln voices for them. Instead, Lincoln has them say something kind of defensive, but still responsive to the broader topic. They ask, well, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? And to prove that it has much to do with it, Lincoln first agrees, at least in part, with the objectors. And he grants, yeah, the gamblers, he says, they constitute a portion of population that is worse than useless. Gamblers are not good citizens. And Lincoln goes so far as to imagine a scenario in which gamblers are annually swept from the stage of existence by the plague. Right? If we could have a kind of gambler-specific COVID, that would just kind of sweep the gamblers off every year. Lincoln says honest men would perhaps be much profited by the operation. So in the short space of a few paragraphs, Lincoln he's just flipped the perspective. You move from a description of the Mississippi hangings as revolting to humanity to the thought that these deaths are, quote, never matter of reasonable regret. Now, this reversal of perspective is even more shocking when Lincoln proceeds to retell the story of McIntosh. Now we learn McIntosh was not just minding his own business. He had committed a heinous murder. And Lincoln says, since he must have died by the sentence of the law, for him, it was as well the way it was. Okay? And Lincoln then says, this is in fact the correct reasoning in regard to the burning of the Negro in St. Louis. Before it was a mulatto man by the name of McIntosh. Now he's just a Negro. No name. But it's the same incident. When you read the speech, you might not even realize he's talking about the same incident, but he is. And this sounds awfully hard-hearted. So Lincoln first tried an all-out appeal to sympathy for the victims, right, of these lynchings and burnings. And then, I think, anticipating the failure of that emotional appeal, he shifts to this very stark, callous reconsideration. And abstractly considered, he says, the direct consequences of mob rule are of little consequence. The direct consequences, in other words, the deaths of those particular individuals, are of little consequence. I think that Lincoln has intuited something very important about his audience. Any approach that focuses only on the direct effects of mob rule is going to be unproductive, because the wider public, some small part of which was acting as a mob, basically welcomes the outcome. Gamblers and criminals quickly dispensed with. Lincoln disposes his audience to listen to him by validating their instinctive hostility to wrongdoers. Two things, however, should be noted. First, I think he renders their concern with justice less heatedly angry and more coolly calculative. And second, when he retells the events in Mississippi, he refers only to the gamblers at Vicksburg in the retelling. And he says nothing about the violence towards allegedly rebellious slaves and their supposed white allies. So by leaving those racially charged lynchings out of his retelling, I think he says nothing to belittle those deaths or to modify his initial horrifying portrait of those deaths. So, what has he done? To the extent that his own convictions allow, Lincoln has basically befriended the vigilantes and their defenders. And that enables him to draw the attention of his audience to consequences that might have escaped their notice. These are indirect consequences, prospective consequences. So Lincoln begins near the viewpoint of his listeners. He does not try to appeal altruistically to their concern for others, or he tried, but it didn't work. And so now he appeals instead to their self-interest, but in a way that is intended to demonstrate to them the linkage between their self-interest and the cause of law-abidingness. So his first point is, well, sometimes mobs make mistakes, and sometimes they hang some of their own. Everybody's caught up in this thing. Mobocrats are not safe from mobocracy. And from there, he widens the circle of concern to the truly innocent, right, who might be targeted, falsely targeted by a mob. He doesn't use boring legal language, doesn't talk about due process and the need for due process, but basically this section of the speech is a vindication of the careful, the methodical, procedural component of the justice system. Then he goes on to point out some further consequences. Once you allow the rule of law to be trodden down, Lincoln points out the vigilantes who were, remember, seeking justice by hanging the gamblers, the vigilantes have released something they did not anticipate. In their impatience for justice, they skirted the law. They were pursuing justice as they understood it, and the law was getting in the way. But what happens? Because public opinion is kind of in support of what they've done, the perpetrators are not punished. That corruption breeds another corruption. When the lawless in spirit see that the law is not being enforced, they take that as an invitation to become lawless in practice. So the vigilantes, remember, are driven by justice. They wanted to crack down on crime, on gambling. Lincoln tells them, guess what you've done? You've actually emboldened the criminals. When law is disregarded for the sake of justice, that provides license for those who would disregard law for selfish purposes of their own. Now, Lincoln doesn't indicate how many people fall into this category of the lawless in spirit. Remember, if you're lawless in spirit, what keeps you from breaking the law? Well, just the fear of being punished. But if government is not now really enforcing law anymore and isn't punishing, then you see this as your opportunity. You move from being lawless in spirit to being lawless in practice. And again, Lincoln doesn't say how many people are lawless in spirit, but he does say there are those who regard government as their deadliest bane and who will make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations. So mob justice always carries this danger. And in fact, even some forms, I think, of legitimate protest. Anytime you have large-scale mass action, there is a danger that it can spiral out of control. So civil unrest, right, is always an occasion for those who are opportunists, right, for the looters, for the scammers, the lawless in spirit who become lawless in practice. Meanwhile, societal breakdown has a very different effect on the good citizens. If government can't control riot and crime, right, the tranquility-loving people lose trust in it. And according to Lincoln, this is actually the worst effect of mob rule. It is the alienation of the affections of the citizens for their government. Now, probably since our own turmoil-filled 1960s and 70s, political scientists, public intellectuals, they've talked about rising levels, cynicism, distrust, apathy, right? And I think that is a kind of confirmation of what Lincoln is saying here, that the attachment of the people is the strongest bulwark of any government, and particularly of democratic government. Democratic government really does depend on the people and the disposition of the people. So according to Lincoln, the end point, once this erosion of confidence kind of takes hold, the end point of that will be regime change. Right? The really dangerous opportunists are not those petty criminals, but the tyrannically inclined. And Lincoln warns that there are men of sufficient talent and ambition, and they will seize the opportunity and strike the blow against free institutions. And he actually says they will be aided by the decent folks, actually aided in a sense by the best citizens who will look to a strong man for deliverance. We, the people, become willing to trade anarchic liberty for despotic security, or at least the demagogic promise of it. Now, Lincoln was not classically schooled. He had not read Plato and Aristotle, but he has basically discovered for himself the disintegrative trajectory of extreme democracy that was first diagnosed by Plato and Aristotle. Now, after he has traced the long-term consequences and how dangerous those long-term consequences are of mob rule, Lincoln finally makes a reference to the recent killing of the abolitionist editor Elijah Lovejoy. Very quick little kind of parenthetical reference. If the audience has been listening to his speech, they might now be inclined to react to current events with a little less knee-jerk fervor, whether that is pro-Lovejoy or anti-Lovejoy. They're now aware of the link between disregard for the law and the destruction of our political institutions. And they will maybe count themselves among those wise citizens who can, because they foresee the danger, act to avert the crisis. Now, what then should they do? Right. The answer, Lincoln says, is simple. Quote, "Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity, swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country, and never to tolerate their violation by others." So Lincoln's solution is absolute law-abidingness. And really more than that, right? He really says this oath to obey the laws should flow from a state of feeling, a kind of reverence. In other words, you shouldn't obey the law out of fear, you should obey the law out of reverence. And he calls reverence for the Constitution and laws, he calls for that reverence to become the political religion of the nation, the political religion of the nation. Now, I think it is logic that has revealed to Lincoln this imperative of law-abidingness. But he's aware that logic or reason alone is not going to secure the required obedience. Here again, he's kind of echoing Aristotle, echoing the ancients. There's a role that has to be played by habituation and a kind of piety, a kind of filial piety in shaping a deferential attitude towards the law. In other words, reverence depends on acculturation. And so Lincoln really assigns the crucial role to teachers, preachers, and especially mothers. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. So it is the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence that establish the binding character of consent-based law. But by appropriating this religious language for political purposes, Lincoln is trying to endow political theory with a sacred character. Okay? And then the final statement about this, he says, "Let reverence for the laws become the political religion of the nation. Let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay, of all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars." All right. Now, I'm going to raise some questions. We might wonder, are there not some exceptions to this first commandment of democratic life? According to Lincoln's list, the imperative to obey the law reverentially applies to every American of whatever age, old or young, economic status, rich or poor, temperament, grave or gay, of whatever sex, whatever ethnic heritage, right, whatever tongue you speak. And then he continues with the two most interesting categories, those of all colors and conditions. Does the demand to revere the Constitution and laws apply to blacks in America in 1838? Surely they are within the orbit of all colors. Does it then apply to those black persons who found themselves in a condition of slavery, as well as to those who found themselves in a condition of freedom? Remember, 1/10 of the black population was free, but 9/10 of the black population was enslaved. Well, even if you think the obligation to obey the law applies to blacks who are free, does it apply to the enslaved black population? How could it? Isn't there a natural right to liberty? Doesn't that natural right to liberty of an enslaved person invalidate any man-made law that establishes property in man? Aren't slaves within their rights to attempt escape? Aren't they even within their rights to murder their masters in their beds? We know that slave masters taught a quietistic version of Christianity to their human chattels, and they emphasized the biblical injunction, slaves, obey your masters. That is a Bible verse. But in American political religion, sworn, as Lincoln says it should be sworn, upon the blood of the Revolution, could never demand or justify the obedience of enslaved persons. Thomas Jefferson was utterly frank about that. Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, said the slaves constitute 1/2 the citizens of the state of Virginia, but we can't really expect them to have any patriotic sentiment. Everything has been taken from them. And moreover, if they choose to exercise their natural right of revolution, God would be on their side. The slaveholder Jefferson declared that the Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us, the slaveholders, in such a contest. All that Lincoln ever wrote about the Declaration of Independence indicates to me that he subscribed to the idea of pre-political natural rights and its by any means necessary ethos. So his call, as I read it, for a political religion of law-abidingness must have application to free citizens only. In effect, slaves remain in a state of war vis-a-vis their masters, their oppressors. But even this exemption for the tyrannized doesn't resolve all the difficulties. If you're trying to combine respect for law with an American creed that enshrines revolutionary resistance to violations of rights. So what, for instance, is the obligation of the friends of the slaves among the citizens? How much must they sacrifice upon the altar of the law? Now, Lincoln acknowledges the problem. Law at its best seeks justice, but law is never identical to justice. And sometimes law is used to establish and maintain injustice. What then? Well, here's what Lincoln says. When I so pressingly urge a strict observance of all the laws, let me not be understood as saying there are no bad laws. I mean to say no such thing. Lincoln, I think, had more experience of bad law than we have. Not only was slavery legal in half the states of the Union, but the entire nation was under a constitutional obligation to return fugitive slaves to bondage. And in an 1855 letter to his slaveholding friend, Joshua Speed, Lincoln describes the terrible sight of slaves being hunted down and caught and carried back to their stripes and unrewarded toils. But he says, I bite my lip and keep quiet. He sees that sight and he says, I bite my lip and keep quiet. But he warns his friend Joshua Speed that the Southerners should not be oblivious to the moral and emotional toll that is exacted by that duty, that constitutional duty. Quote, you ought rather to appreciate how much the great body of the Northern people do crucify their feelings in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union. Lincoln compares obedience to the Fugitive Slave Clause as a crucifixion. He is stressing the agony of compliance. The slaves are not the only sufferers. All individuals of conscience suffered under the slave system. And in this one regard, at least, the Constitution required the sacrifice of one's moral and humane sentiments. So Lincoln is delivering a hard lesson in democratic theory. For citizens, he says there is no option of, quote, civil disobedience. All disobedience is uncivil and it is destructive of civil government. Now, there is a right of revolution, but short of that exigency, there is only acknowledgement of the majority's legitimate power through their ballots to determine the motion of the body politic. Now, it is not that the majority is always right. As we know, it frequently is not right. But the majority does have rightful authority. And that authority is itself grounded in the truth of natural equality. Right? Why are we bound by majority rule? Because we're all created equal. There are no natural rulers among us. The only way to establish legitimate rule is through the ballots of a majority. Now, Lincoln does offer a glimmer of hope and change. He points out there is a democratic mechanism for addressing the problem of bad laws. Bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible. Yet he immediately repeats the desideratum. Still, while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed. How much time do we have left, Dustin?
No. 4 or 5 minutes.
Oh, gee, we do not have enough time. Do you all have class after this? Put your hands up. How many of you have class? Oh. Any possibility of finishing the lecture, allowing people to just get up and leave when they have to?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Good. Thank you for being so compliant. Okay. Now, Martin Luther King. Influenced by Henry David Thoreau and the antinomianism of Henry David Thoreau and Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, King famously argued that one can show respect for law and one can speed the repeal of bad law by means of a specific mode of lawbreaking. You know the passage from King's letter from a Birmingham jail? King says, one who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. So Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., I believe the two of them are often viewed as the nation's greatest moral lights. Right? They both have monuments in Washington, D.C., but they fundamentally disagree on this very foundational question of the nature of citizenship and the relationship between law and justice. And I think there's probably no better exercise for all Americans. This is the assignment that you guys who are leaving have, okay? You have to read these two texts. Read Lincoln's Lyceum and King's letter side by side and make a good faith effort to suspend your own biases, which I suspect are usually on the side of King, so as to test the logic of the two positions. Now, for Lincoln, the citizen's choice is limited to the ballot or the bullet. Right? Bullet is that right of revolution. Ballot is a kind of shorthand, not just for the elective franchise, but all of those tools of democratic persuasion, right? Free speech, free press, rights of assembly, petition, access to the courts, and so on. But outright disobedience, outright nullification, no matter how nonviolent, is impermissible. Impermissible whether it's Thoreau's minority of one or whether it's John C. Calhoun's minority of South Carolina. Right, which also engaged in a kind of nullification. They claimed there was a right of state interposition against federal laws that they regarded as unjust or discriminatory. Now, I do believe that there is much to celebrate in King's legacy, but it still seems to me an open question whether his advocacy of civil disobedience, particularly in that essay, whether it has not, as Lincoln predicted, eroded respect for the rule of law. Could the 20th century struggle for civil rights have been conducted exclusively through the constitutionally prescribed, constitutionally allowable methods? And in considering this, it is very important to remember that no law breaking was involved in most of the techniques and activities of the civil rights movement. The battle in the courts waged by the NAACP, all perfectly legal. The dangerous work of voter registration in the South, all perfectly legal. The Montgomery bus boycott, right? Boycotts involve no law breaking. The freedom rides, right? The Supreme Court had already said that interstate travel should be on a non-segregated basis. They were just putting that to the test by traveling on buses through the South. Again, it was very dangerous, but perfectly legal. All of these similar heroic instances of nonviolent mass protests, all perfectly, fully within the law. At the least, I think one might say that the popularity of King's Birmingham jail essay has kind of inflated the role that lawbreaking, as distinct from other forms of protest, the role that lawbreaking played in bringing about positive social change, both in King's own endeavors and very much so within the larger civil rights struggle. Now, just then to return to Lincoln to wrap this up. After Lincoln gives his diagnosis of the present danger and prescribes the cure, you might think the speech ought to be over, right? But instead of wrapping things up, he poses one more question. He says, why should we suppose danger to our political institutions? Haven't we preserved them for more than 50 years already? And the question, I think, is an indication that beneath this sort of surface ferment of the moment, there's actually a kind of cavalier complacency about the American future. And Lincoln now has to address that. And now he shifts from the present danger, which is mob rule, to some heretofore unnoticed, unrealized future dangers. And to do this, he goes back to the founding. And he now gives a very different portrayal than he originally did. So remember, he told the stories of the lynchings, then he retold them in a kind of opposite perspective. Now, he reassesses the founding. At the beginning of the speech, full of praise for the founding. Hardy, brave, patriotic generation. Now, on reconsideration, he says, well, it turns out that our ancestors, they kind of fell into two categories. There's the few and the many. And those two groups had different motivations, but equally questionable motivations. And we now learn that in 1776, what were the few interested in? Fame, celebrity, and distinction. And what about the many? Well, they were driven by deep-rooted principles of hate and the powerful motive of revenge, directed exclusively against the British. So at the end of the speech, Lincoln kind of strips away the patriotic drapery from our image of the past. And why does he do it? Because he wants to warn his audience about the bad effects those very same passions will have in the future, in the post-founding generation. Ambitious individuals are going to remain, right? If their ambition rivals that of the founders, how will they satisfy it? What glory is there in being the 16th president? Or what glory is there in being the 47th president, who was also the 45th president? Well, it's just like being the custodian in the house of the fathers. If you just stay within that constitutional framework, as Lincoln puts it, what, think you these places would satisfy an Alexander, a Caesar, a Napoleon? Never! Those who belong to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle simply can't be contained within this sort of modest, moderate horizon of the Republican regime. So Lincoln announces that it's going to be up to the people to frustrate a future Napoleon, an American Napoleon. And the people will have to be united with each other, they'll have to be attached to the government and laws, and they'll have to be intelligent if they're going to pull this off. And we might say, well, is that what the founding generation of the people were like? Well, no. Another surprising reassessment of the founding. What about the ordinary folks at the time of the founding? Well, it wasn't that they were so intelligent and united and thoughtful. It was that their passions were riled up by the interesting scenes of the Revolution. The spectacle of the fight for independence had some good effects. Okay? And it allowed passions like hate and revenge to be put to good purpose because they could be directed against the British. And other passions like envy and jealousy and avarice, they were just sort of suppressed. Lincoln is coldly and brutally honest. The patriotism and the bravery that we celebrate were forged from what he calls the basest principles of our nature. And according to Lincoln, the problem of the American future is that those divisive passions will now be turned inward, directed against fellow citizens. And so his conclusion is emphatic. He says, passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Passion is our enemy. Now, just like Lincoln's demand for reverential obedience, I think this anti-passion message is hard for us to hear. You guys are going to hear a graduation speech, I don't know, in a year, 2 years, 3 years. I can tell you what that graduation speaker will say. That graduation speaker will say, find your passion, live your passion. But the celebration of passion has a downside for our politics. A passionate and impassioning politics is likely to be marked by hyperpartisanship, hate-filled invective, insufferable self-righteousness, and general nastiness. So Lincoln, from this Lyceum address all the way through to his second inaugural, rejects attempts to impassion political life. He will speak against slavery, very powerful words, but he never speaks against slaveholders. He's skittish even about appeals to compassion. Why? Because if you're compassionate, then you're suffering along with the sufferer, and that usually provokes anger at those who cause the suffering. So Lincoln never tries to evoke the horrors of the institution of slavery in the way that the abolitionist orators did. He's always trying to lift the debate, lift the discourse to the level of principle and unimpassioned reason. So he wants to avoid compassion, anger, and blame. All right, this really is the very end now. Give me 30 more seconds. So the Lyceum address began by describing what's our task, preserve this edifice of liberty, equal rights. But towards the end of the speech, I think he has really indicated that the task of maintenance or perpetuation is actually harder than the task of establishment or founding. And he says that, in fact, this temple of liberty needs to be outfitted anew. It needs new pillars, and those pillars have to be built, hewn from the rock of sober reason, not from passion. And so until reason rather than passion presides in the souls of Americans, the capability of a people to govern itself is actually still unproven. So according to Lincoln, the post-founding generations, and that means your generation, right? You guys are a post-founding generation as well. You have a challenging task before you. It's a task that actually rivals and surpasses that of the founding. Each subsequent generation of Americans must give its own demonstration, practical demonstration, of the possibility of self-government. So Lincoln has actually opened a new and quite expansive avenue for Republican ambition. Quarter century later, in the Gettysburg Address, he will call it the unfinished work, the great task remaining before us. So self-government in the collective depends on the existence of self-governing individuals. It turns out that there is no perpetuation without betterment, and there is no better guide to that betterment than Abraham Lincoln. I wanted some time for questions with you all. I think there's a lot to discuss, but do you have to let people go? Want to take a couple questions? Yeah, especially questions from students, yeah.
Sure. So at the beginning, we were talking about the threats to a government, one being time and favorite institution, and the other new practices can destroy original.
Yeah, usurpation, getting used to something by use. Yeah.
So which can erode a government faster, citizen disobedience or an institution defecting from its original ways of operating?
Yeah.
Like, can one group completely erode the government, or does it take hold for a government to fall?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Lincoln, it does seem to me, is most concerned with the character of the people. I think he thinks that the institutions, because of the structure, the separate powers, the checks and balances, that for the most part, at least as he foresees, that system works well. Right? Those branches keep each other in check. Now, that may no longer be the case for us. Right? The amendment changes over time, and we really thrown off that separation of powers. Certain branches may have become too weak. Congress has become completely dysfunctional. The executive is becoming more powerful in response to that. Right? So our situation may be a little bit different from them. We still have to be concerned about the character of the people, and you may be right that fundamentally that is what is most important. But if there are now, if we are structurally out of whack as well, then our system is even worse, right? Our situation is worse than his situation. He thought the main danger related to the character of the people and whether they would be alert to the danger coming from the tyrannical incline.
I have a question. There's another student. So we have an example recently. You invited us to. Thank you. It was a lovely speech. You invited us to apply this talk to our own moment. We have a recent example of a mob invading the Capitol, and I think an advocate of that mob would say, "We defy the law in the name of justice."
Yeah, right. So one thing I think my presentation might suggest is, how would you talk to those who are not part of the mob but have some sympathy with the actions of the mob? And there's a large chunk of American citizens who are in sympathy.
So the question,
Yeah.
Does the pardoning of the infringements of the law of those participants, according to the logic of this speech, not represent a direct invitation to lawlessness?
Yeah. In other words, that's part of what Lincoln says. If these things go unpunished, or they were punished, but then that punishment is reversed, that's a kind of further invitation to more lawlessness. But remember, that was not the only mob action of the last few years. We saw takeovers by the left, right? Antifa, the occupying of federal buildings in Minneapolis, the destruction of police stations out west in Portland and Seattle, and those were not punished to the same degree or at all the way those who participated in the mob completely disapprove of at the Capitol. But that difference in enforcement, that itself is part of what is driving, further mob action by those, by the other side. So I think there are really serious problems when you're tolerating some mobs and not tolerating other mobs. In a way, my main point is, well, what can we learn from Lincoln about how to talk to one another? And Lincoln is sort of saying, find the points, the only way you can talk to somebody who really disagrees with you is to find some point of agreement. Find something you can say without compromising your own stance or your own principles to show you understand their concerns, you understand what's driving them. So he really is trying to open up some space for civil discord. And think of how hard it is. I mean, the issue is over whether you are pro-slavery or anti-slavery. There's not much give there. How can we find a way to talk about this issue? In that sense, I think our current splits are not as severe as the splits that Lincoln was having. But we are dealing with them in ways that are just making it worse. I don't know, is that an answer to you or not? I mean,
We're in a complex moment.
Okay, there are also ways of saying things that just, are not engaging, and sometimes that's the way to deal with it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Probably contains the same book. Is there a difference? I don't know, like Antifa and the thing in Seattle and St. Madison, there was invasion of capitals. Is that in the same order of President of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the mob. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that, yes, he bears, he certainly bears some
In some of
responsibility for
those
that.
cases, there was state law involved, and this is federal law.
Yeah, but I think I don't accept that. I mean, I think that that allowing those kinds of actions to go on were extraordinarily destructive of property, destructive of life there in some cases as well. They were very, very bad. And the absolute just turning a blind eye to that. Much as I completely agree, I call it insurrection. It was a mob. It was completely disgraceful and should have been punished. I do think it is worth pointing out that the claim was that that there was electoral malfeasance. but there's still a recognition there that what we want is elections, that we want ballots to define outcomes. Now, that might be a lie, right, that there was, it wasn't a stolen election, okay, Biden won the election. But I think it is salutary that there was still a kind of adherence to the notion of elections as determinative. So again, that's not as serious as what happened in the Civil War, where secession was an attempt to overturn the result of a perfectly valid constitutional election. So we should maybe be thankful for some small things that are better about our situation than the situation in Lincoln's case.
Great. Well, I don't want to bring the conversation to a close because you can, of course, come up and ask questions if you have more questions. Again, I would highly recommend this book. His great speeches. The 3 speeches are the Lyceum address, the Gettysburg Address, and the second inaugural. We'll hear about the second inaugural tonight, but you heard a little bit about the Lyceum Address. If you want to learn more about it, it's
Yeah, the
first
treatment there is
chapter
about
here.
4 times as long as
Yeah,
as
it's a
the
much longer
yeah.
treatment, so there's more to be said about it. So please enjoy some of the snacks in the back before you leave, and come up and ask questions if you have questions for Dr. Shaub. But let's give her a round of applause for